Imagine discovering a wedding photograph from the Victorian era, a beautiful image that captures what appears to be the perfect matrimonial celebration, with the bride radiant in white lace, the groom proud in his formal attire, and family members gathered around him with expressions of joy and blessing. The photograph seems to embody everything noble about marriage, family, and social celebration in 1875. But what if careful examination revealed that one of the most prominent figures in the portrait, a woman whose smile illuminated the entire composition, had been dead for 3 days when the photograph was taken? What if that radiant expression of joy was not the glow of happiness, but the careful artistry of a mortician who had prepared a corpse to participate in a celebration she would never live to see? This is the story of how a single wedding photograph revealed the lengths to which a grieving family would go to preserve the illusion of completeness, and how the Victorian practice of post-mortem photography evolved into something far more disturbing than simple memorial portraiture: the use of the dead to fulfill the social expectations of the living, regardless of the psychological and spiritual cost to all involved. The year was 1875, and in the prosperous mill town of Millbrook, Massachusetts, the Whitmore family was preparing for what promised to be the social event of the season. Their eldest daughter, Catherine, was to marry Mr. Jonathan Blackwood, heir to a successful textile manufacturing fortune, in a ceremony that would unite two of the region's most prominent families and establish both households' positions in New England's emerging industrial aristocracy. The wedding preparations had been underway for months, with every detail carefully orchestrated to reflect the family's prosperity and social standing. The ceremony would take place at St. Mary's Episcopal Church, followed by an elaborate reception at the Whitmore estate on Elm Street. Invitations had been extended to over 200 guests, including local dignitaries, business associates, and family members traveling from as far away as New York and Philadelphia. But 3 days before the ceremony was scheduled to take place, tragedy struck the Whitmore household with devastating suddenness. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, Catherine's mother and the primary organizer of the wedding celebration, collapsed suddenly while overseeing final preparations in the family's kitchen. Dr. William Morrison, the family physician, was summoned immediately, but his examination revealed that Eleanor had suffered a massive stroke that left her unconscious and barely breathing. Eleanor Whitmore had been the heart of her family and the social architect of Catherine's wedding. She had spent months planning every detail of the ceremony and reception, from the selection of flowers to the arrangement of seating charts that would properly honor the complex social hierarchies of New England's emerging industrial elite. Her sudden illness created not only a personal crisis for the family, but a logistical nightmare that threatened to derail the most important social event they had ever undertaken. Dr. Morrison's prognosis was grim. Eleanor remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and irregular, her body occasionally convulsing in ways that suggested significant brain damage. While it was theoretically possible that she might survive, the physician made it clear that recovery was highly unlikely and that the family should prepare for the worst. "I'm afraid Mrs. Whitmore's condition is extremely grave," Dr. Morrison told James Whitmore, Eleanor's husband and a prominent local businessman. "The damage to her brain appears to be extensive. Even if she survives, it is unlikely that she would regain consciousness or meaningful function. I believe you should gather the family and prepare for the possibility that she may not recover." The timing of Eleanor's collapse could not have been worse. Wedding guests were already traveling to Millbrook from distant cities. Catering arrangements had been finalized, with enormous quantities of food ordered and prepared. The church had been decorated, and the reception venue had been transformed into an elegant celebration space. Most significantly, the social and financial obligations associated with the wedding were too extensive to cancel or postpone without enormous cost and public embarrassment. Catherine, the bride-to-be, was devastated by her mother's condition, but found herself caught between grief and the enormous pressure of social expectations. The wedding represented not just a personal celebration, but a crucial business alliance between two powerful families. Cancelling or postponing the ceremony would have significant financial implications for both households and would create social scandal that might affect the family's reputations for years to come. James Whitmore faced an impossible choice. His wife lay dying, possibly already beyond hope of recovery, while his family's social and financial obligations demanded that he proceed with a celebration that no longer seemed appropriate or possible. The guests expected Eleanor to serve as the gracious hostess and maternal figure who would officially welcome their daughter's new husband into the family. Her absence would be noticed by everyone and would require explanations that might compromise the celebratory atmosphere the families desperately needed to maintain. It was Catherine's younger sister, Margaret, who first suggested the solution that would ultimately lead to one of the most disturbing episodes in the history of Victorian social deception. Margaret had always been considered the most practical and determined member of the family, with a ruthless approach to problem-solving that sometimes disturbed her more conventional relatives. Mother would want Catherine's wedding to proceed exactly as planned, Margaret told her father during a private conversation in Eleanor's sick room. She spent months organizing every detail because she understood how important this marriage is for our family's future. If she could speak, she would insist that we find a way to ensure the wedding celebration honors all her preparations. When James pointed out that Eleanor was unconscious and possibly dying, Margaret's response revealed the depth of her determination to preserve the family's social obligations regardless of personal cost. Dr. Morrison says she might not survive the night, Margaret continued, but he also says she could linger for days or even weeks in her current condition. We cannot postpone the wedding indefinitely waiting for resolution of her illness. We need to find a way for Mother to participate in Catherine's celebration, whether she is conscious or not. The plan that Margaret proposed was both ingenious and horrifying. If Eleanor died before the wedding ceremony, they would conceal her death from the guests and arrange for her apparent participation in the celebration through the careful application of post-mortem preparation techniques. Eleanor would be dressed in her finest gown, positioned in a chair during the reception, and presented to guests as resting due to exhaustion from the wedding preparations. The family's closest associates would assume she was simply tired, while more distant guests would have no reason to suspect anything unusual about her quiet presence at the celebration. James Whitmore was initially horrified by his daughter's suggestion. The idea of using his wife's corpse as a prop in a social celebration violated every normal instinct about death, mourning, and appropriate family behavior. But as Margaret continued to elaborate on the plan, he began to see the practical advantages of an approach that would allow them to fulfill their social obligations while preserving Eleanor's apparent participation in the wedding she had worked so hard to organize. Mother always said that appearances matter more than feelings in situations where family reputation is at stake, Margaret argued. She would understand that preserving the success of Catherine's wedding is more important than conventional mourning practices. We can grieve privately after the guests have departed, but we cannot allow her illness to destroy the celebration that represents months of her careful planning. The moral compromises required by Margaret's plan were staggering, but the family found themselves facing social and financial pressures that seemed to make conventional responses impossible. The wedding could not be cancelled without enormous cost and public embarrassment. Eleanor's absence would require explanations that might compromise the celebratory atmosphere crucial to the family's business and social objectives. Most persuasively, Eleanor herself had always prioritized family social obligations over personal comfort or conventional behavior. Dr. Morrison, when consulted about the plan, was initially appalled by the suggestion that he participate in deceiving wedding guests about Eleanor's condition or death. His medical ethics and personal integrity seemed to preclude any involvement in such an elaborate deception. But the Whitmore family's social prominence and his own financial dependence on their patronage created pressures that gradually overcame his moral objections. I cannot ethically participate in presenting a deceased person as living, Dr. Morrison told James Whitmore during a consultation about the proposed deception. My medical training and professional integrity require honesty about patient conditions and outcomes. I cannot assist in deceiving your wedding guests about Mrs. Whitmore's true status. But when Margaret outlined the specific role she envisioned for Dr. Morrison in implementing their plan, he began to understand how his medical expertise could be essential to creating a deception sophisticated enough to fool even close family friends. We need your knowledge of anatomy and preservation techniques to ensure that Mother appears natural and comfortable during the wedding celebration, Margaret explained. Your understanding of rigor mortis, blood circulation, and tissue preservation could help us maintain appearances that would be impossible to achieve without medical expertise. The financial incentives that the Whitmore family offered for Dr. Morrison's participation were substantial enough to compromise his ethical objections. The family was willing to pay him more for one day of assistance with their deception than he typically earned in several months of conventional medical practice. The economic pressures of maintaining a medical practice in a small Massachusetts town made it difficult for him to refuse an opportunity that would provide financial security for his own family. Eleanor Whitmore died on the evening of October 12, 1875, exactly 24 hours before Catherine's wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin. Her death was peaceful, with no dramatic struggles or distressing symptoms that might have complicated the family's planned deception. She simply stopped breathing during the night, allowing her body to begin the natural processes of death, while the family finalized their preparations for using her corpse in the following day's celebration. The post-mortem preparation of Eleanor's body was conducted with meticulous attention to creating an appearance of natural sleep rather than death. Dr. Morrison used his knowledge of anatomy and preservation to position her body in ways that would appear comfortable and natural to wedding guests who might observe her from a distance. Her skin was treated with cosmetics that restored a lifelike color. Her hair was arranged in her characteristic style, and her clothing was selected to create an impression of elegant repose rather than death. Most importantly, Eleanor's facial features were carefully arranged to create an expression of peaceful contentment that would suggest she was resting comfortably rather than deceased. Her eyes were closed in a way that appeared natural rather than permanent. Her mouth was positioned in a subtle smile that reflected maternal satisfaction with her daughter's wedding, and her hands were folded in her lap in a gesture that suggested relaxed observation of the celebration around her. The wedding ceremony itself proceeded without incident, with Catherine and Jonathan exchanging vows in St. Mary's Episcopal Church before a congregation of 200 guests who had no reason to suspect the tragedy that had befallen the bride's family. Eleanor's absence from the ceremony was explained as a decision to rest at home in preparation for hosting the reception, an explanation that most guests found reasonable given the enormous stress associated with organizing such an elaborate celebration. It was during the reception at the Whitmore estate that Eleanor made her posthumous appearance as the gracious hostess and proud mother that her family's social obligations required her to be. She was positioned in an ornate chair near the main entrance to the reception hall, where guests could easily approach her to offer congratulations and social pleasantries. Her placement allowed her to appear actively engaged in the celebration, while minimizing the need for direct interaction that might reveal her true condition. The deception proved remarkably successful, with most wedding guests accepting Eleanor's quiet presence as evidence of maternal dignity and appropriate celebration of her daughter's marriage. Guests who approached her chair found her apparently resting peacefully, and those who commented on her reserved demeanor were told that she was conserving her energy to ensure she could properly enjoy the entire celebration. Dr. Morrison, positioned discreetly near Eleanor's chair, was available to handle any situations that might threaten to expose a deception. His medical authority allowed him to discourage guests from approaching too closely or attempting to engage Eleanor in extended conversations. When necessary, he could suggest that Eleanor was experiencing mild fatigue and should be allowed to rest without disturbance. The wedding photographer, Mr. Silas Cunningham, was directed to include Eleanor in all formal family portraits, positioning her prominently among the celebrating family members in ways that would document her apparent participation in Catherine's special day. These photographs were intended to serve as permanent evidence that Eleanor had been present for her daughter's wedding, creating visual memories that would support the family's version of events for years to come. The formal wedding portrait that would become the centerpiece of the family's photographic collection showed Eleanor seated beside Catherine, her hand resting gently on her daughter's arm in a gesture of maternal blessing and support. Her expression, carefully crafted through post-mortem preparation, radiated the kind of joy and pride that mothers traditionally display at their daughters' weddings. The technical quality of the photograph was exceptional, capturing fine details of Eleanor's dress, jewelry, and facial expression with remarkable clarity. What made the wedding portrait particularly compelling was the natural way Eleanor appeared to interact with the other family members surrounding her. Her positioning suggested active engagement with the celebration rather than passive observation. Her expression seemed to respond to the joy of the moment rather than reflecting the artificial arrangements of post-mortem photography. Most remarkably, her smile appeared genuine and spontaneous, as if she were genuinely delighted by her daughter's happiness. The success of the deception during the wedding reception exceeded even Margaret's optimistic expectations. Guests complimented Eleanor on her elegance and grace, commented on her obvious pride in Catherine's marriage, and expressed admiration for her ability to maintain such dignity and poise during what must have been an emotionally overwhelming day. Several family friends remarked on how well Eleanor looked, attributing her peaceful demeanor to the satisfaction of seeing her eldest daughter successfully married to such a worthy young man. As the reception progressed into the evening, Eleanor's apparent presence became increasingly integral to the celebration's success. Her quiet dignity provided a stabilizing influence that allowed other family members to enjoy the festivities without the distraction of obvious grief or absence. Guests felt comfortable approaching her chair to offer congratulations and express their appreciation for the elegant celebration she had organized. Her gracious acceptance of these social pleasantries, managed through carefully rehearsed responses from family members speaking on her behalf, maintained the impression that she was fully engaged in her daughter's special day. The wedding photographer took dozens of images throughout the celebration, capturing Eleanor in various group compositions and family arrangements that documented her comprehensive participation in the day's events. These photographs showed her interacting naturally with relatives, appearing to observe the dancing and festivities, and maintaining the kind of maternal oversight that guests expected from the bride's mother during such an important family celebration. But what none of the wedding guests realized was that they were participating in an elaborate theatrical performance in which the central maternal figure was a carefully prepared corpse whose apparent engagement with the celebration was entirely artificial. The woman whose gracious presence had provided such comfort and stability to the wedding reception had been dead for over 24 hours when the photographs were taken. The technical skill required to maintain Eleanor's lifelike appearance throughout the entire reception was remarkable, requiring constant attention from Dr. Morrison and other family members who understood the true nature of her condition. Her body temperature had to be monitored and adjusted to prevent the kind of coldness that might be noticed by guests who came close to her chair. Her facial expression required periodic adjustment to maintain the appearance of natural responsiveness to the celebration around her. Most challengingly, her body position needed occasional modification to prevent the kind of settling and stiffening that would make her artificial condition obvious to observant guests. The psychological toll of maintaining such an elaborate deception while grieving Eleanor's death was enormous for the family members who knew the truth about her condition. James Whitmore found himself simultaneously celebrating his daughter's marriage and mourning his wife's death, creating an emotional conflict that challenged his ability to participate naturally in the wedding festivities. Catherine experienced her wedding day as both the happiest and most horrifying experience of her life, knowing that her mother's apparent blessing was actually the result of post-mortem manipulation rather than genuine maternal joy. Margaret, who had conceived and orchestrated the entire deception, discovered that her practical approach to problem-solving had created moral and emotional complications she had not anticipated. While the plan had succeeded in preserving the family's social obligations and allowing Catherine's wedding to proceed as planned, it had also required her to view her mother's corpse as a tool for social performance rather than a beloved family member deserving of respectful mourning. The wedding reception concluded successfully, with guests departing under the impression that they had witnessed a perfect family celebration, blessed by the gracious presence of all key family members. Eleanor's apparent participation in the festivities had provided the social validation and family completeness that made the wedding a complete success, according to Victorian standards of domestic and social achievement. But as the last guest departed and the family was left alone with the reality of what they had accomplished, the true cost of their deception began to become apparent. They had successfully preserved their social obligations and protected Catherine's wedding from the disruption of Eleanor's death, but they had also crossed moral and ethical boundaries that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The wedding photographs that documented Eleanor's posthumous participation in her daughter's celebration would serve as permanent reminders of the family's willingness to sacrifice conventional morality for social appearance. The beautiful images that seemed to capture perfect family happiness would forever conceal the horrifying reality that one of their most prominent figures had been dead throughout the entire celebration. Eleanor's radiant smile in the wedding portrait, so carefully crafted to appear spontaneous and joyful, had been created through post-mortem manipulation that allowed a corpse to serve the social needs of the living. The expression that appeared to radiate maternal pride and blessing was actually the result of manual positioning of facial muscles and careful application of cosmetics to create an illusion of life and emotion in death. As the family began the process of cleaning up after the reception and returning their home to its normal condition, they faced the challenge of transitioning from their elaborate deception back to the reality of Eleanor's death. and the conventional mourning processes they had postponed to preserve Catherine's wedding celebration. The woman who had stood smiling in the 1875 wedding portrait, apparently radiating joy and maternal pride, had indeed been dead for days when the photograph was taken. But her posthumous performance had been so convincing that even those who knew her best had moments of forgetting the artificial nature of her participation in the celebration. The success of their deception would ultimately prove more disturbing than comforting, as the family discovered that some boundaries between life and death should never be crossed, regardless of the social pressures that seemed to require such compromises. The 3 months that followed Catherine Whitmore's wedding were marked by a series of increasingly disturbing events that would ultimately reveal the true cost of using the dead to fulfill the obligations of the living. What had initially seemed like a successful social deception, allowing Eleanor Whitmore to participate posthumously in her daughter's wedding, gradually evolved into a nightmare of psychological, spiritual, and supernatural consequences that challenged the family's understanding of life, death, and the boundaries that separate them. The immediate aftermath of the wedding had proceeded according to the family's careful planning. Eleanor's death was officially announced 3 days after the celebration, with the family explaining that she had passed away peacefully in her sleep, following a brief illness that had developed after the wedding. This timeline allowed them to maintain the fiction that she had been alive and well during Catherine's marriage ceremony, preserving the legitimacy of her apparent participation in the celebration while providing a plausible explanation for her subsequent death. The funeral arrangements were handled with the same meticulous attention to social appearance that had characterized the wedding deception. Eleanor was laid out in the family's front parlor, dressed in the same elegant black silk gown she had worn to several important social functions, with her hair arranged in the style that had been her trademark throughout her adult life. The viewing was scheduled for 2 days, allowing friends and community members to pay their respects to a woman who had been a prominent figure in Millbrook's social hierarchy. But from the moment visitors began arriving for the viewing, something seemed fundamentally wrong with Eleanor's appearance and the atmosphere surrounding her prepared body. Multiple guests commented on the unusual expression that seemed to be frozen on her face, not the peaceful repose typically associated with death, but rather a subtle smile that appeared almost animated, as if she were aware of and amused by something invisible to the living observers around her. Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, a longtime family friend who had known Eleanor for over 20 years, was among the first to notice the disturbing quality of the corpse's expression. "I've attended many viewings over the years," she told Margaret Whitmore, "but I've never seen a deceased person whose face seemed so active. It's as if she's listening to conversations we can't hear, or watching something happening that's invisible to the rest of us." Dr. Morrison, who had been responsible for Eleanor's post-mortem preparation during the wedding and was now overseeing her funeral arrangements, found himself deeply troubled by the changes he observed in her body during the viewing period. Under normal circumstances, a corpse's facial features would gradually relax into complete stillness as the processes of death progressed. But Eleanor's expression seemed to become more animated rather than less, as if her awareness of her surroundings was increasing rather than diminishing. "I've never encountered anything like this in 20 years of medical practice," Dr. Morrison confided to James Whitmore during a private consultation. "Typically, facial expressions in deceased individuals become increasingly neutral as rigor mortis progresses, but your wife's features seem to be developing more definite expressions over time, almost as if she's responding to stimuli that we cannot perceive." The funeral service at St. Mary's Episcopal Church was conducted with full ceremonial honors appropriate to Eleanor's social position and community contributions. Father McKenna delivered a eulogy that praised her dedication to family, her charitable work among the community's less fortunate residents, and her skill in organizing social events that brought together Millbrook's most prominent families. The church was filled to capacity with mourners who genuinely grieved the loss of a woman who had been instrumental in maintaining the social fabric of their small but prosperous community. But even during the formal funeral service, attendees noticed something unusual about Eleanor's appearance in her open casket. Rather than the peaceful stillness that typically characterizes the dead during their final public appearance, Eleanor seemed almost alert, as if she were actively participating in her own funeral service. Several mourners commented quietly about the lifelike quality of her expression and the way her features seemed to reflect awareness of the eulogies being delivered in her honor. Catherine, the bride whose wedding had been preserved through her mother's posthumous participation, found herself profoundly disturbed by her mother's appearance during the funeral. "She looks more alive now than she did during my wedding reception," Catherine whispered to her sister Margaret during the service. "It's as if dying has somehow made her more present rather than less. I can't shake the feeling that she's watching everything and forming opinions about how we're handling her funeral arrangements." The burial at Millbrook Cemetery proceeded without obvious incident, but the family's sense of unease continued to grow as they observed phenomena that seemed to defy normal expectations about death and interment. As Eleanor's casket was lowered into the ground, several family members reported hearing what sounded like soft laughter coming from within the wooden container. Though they acknowledged that such sounds were probably impossible and likely represented their own psychological stress rather than genuine supernatural phenomena. Margaret, who had conceived and orchestrated the wedding deception, found herself experiencing the most severe psychological effects of what the family had done. In the weeks following Eleanor's burial, she began having vivid dreams in which her deceased mother appeared to criticize her handling of the family's social obligations and to offer detailed advice about household management, child rearing, and community relations. "Mother visits me every night," Margaret told Dr. Morrison during a consultation about her deteriorating mental condition. "She's not angry about what we did during Catherine's wedding. In fact, she seems pleased that we found a way to preserve the family's social obligations despite her inconvenient timing. But she's very concerned about how we're managing household affairs now that she's not available to provide direct supervision." The dreams that Margaret described were remarkably detailed and consistent, featuring conversations with Eleanor about specific family matters that Margaret claimed to remember with perfect clarity upon waking. Even more disturbing was the accuracy of the advice and information that Eleanor provided during these dream encounters, which often concerned family history and social connections that Margaret had never known about during her mother's lifetime. James Whitmore began experiencing his own supernatural encounters with his deceased wife, though his took the form of waking visions rather than dreams. He would frequently see Eleanor standing in doorways or sitting in her favorite chair, always smiling with the same expression she had worn during Catherine's wedding reception. These visions were so vivid and realistic that he often found himself speaking to her before realizing that he was addressing empty air. "She looks exactly as she did during the wedding celebration," James told Dr. Morrison. "Not sick or dying as she appeared during her final days, but healthy and elegant as she was when we first arranged her for the reception. It's as if that version of her, the carefully prepared, socially appropriate version, is the one that survived death and continues to interact with our family." Catherine's psychological state became increasingly fragile as she struggled to integrate her wedding memories with the knowledge of what had actually occurred during the celebration. Her recollections of the happiest day of her life were permanently contaminated by the awareness that her mother's apparent blessing and participation had been artificially created through post-mortem manipulation. "I can't look at my wedding photographs without seeing the truth behind Mother's smile," Catherine told her new husband Jonathan, during one of their increasingly frequent arguments about her mental condition. "Every time I remember her pride and joy during the reception, I'm reminded that those expressions were created by Dr. Morrison's hands positioning her facial muscles rather than genuine maternal emotion." The psychological trauma of living with the knowledge that their most cherished family memories were built on deception began to affect every aspect of the family's daily life. Normal social interactions became difficult as family members struggled to maintain the fiction that Eleanor had been alive and well during Catherine's wedding while dealing with their own guilt and horror about what they had actually done. But the supernatural phenomena that began manifesting in the Whitmore household suggested that their deception had created consequences that extended far beyond psychological distress. Eleanor's spirit, rather than resting peacefully in death, seemed to have become anchored to the living world through her artificial participation in Catherine's wedding, creating a form of supernatural bondage that prevented her from transitioning normally to whatever realm awaited the deceased. The first clear evidence of Eleanor's supernatural presence occurred during a dinner party that James hosted in December 1875, approximately 2 months after Eleanor's funeral. The family was entertaining several business associates and their wives, attempting to re-establish their social connections and demonstrate that they were successfully managing their household. Despite Eleanor's death, during the formal dinner, multiple guests reported seeing a woman in an elegant blue gown standing behind James's chair, her hands resting on his shoulders in a gesture of wifely support and affection. The woman's appearance matched Eleanor's exactly, and several guests who had known her well were convinced that she was physically present in the dining room, despite knowing that she had been buried months earlier. Mrs. Adelaide Spencer, one of Eleanor's closest friends, was so certain of what she had seen that she approached James after the dinner to inquire about Eleanor's remarkable recovery from what had been described as a fatal illness. "I'm so delighted to see that Eleanor is feeling better," Mrs. Spencer told James as the guests were preparing to leave. "She looked absolutely radiant during dinner, exactly as she appeared during Catherine's wedding reception. I was under the impression that her condition had been quite serious, but she seems to have made a complete recovery." James's attempts to explain that Eleanor had indeed died and been buried were met with confusion and disbelief from guests who were certain they had seen her during the dinner party. The disconnect between the family's insistence that Eleanor was deceased and the guests' clear memories of her presence during the evening created a social crisis that threatened to expose the artificial nature of Eleanor's participation in Catherine's wedding. Dr. Morrison, when consulted about the supernatural manifestations, acknowledged that the family's deception during the wedding had created unprecedented circumstances that might have prevented Eleanor's spirit from transitioning normally to death. By using Mrs. Whitmore's body to fulfill social obligations after her death, you may have created a form of spiritual confusion that prevents her consciousness from accepting the reality of her own mortality, he explained to James during a private consultation. Her spirit may believe that she is still alive and responsible for fulfilling her family duties, creating a supernatural bondage that anchors her to the living world. The supernatural manifestations became increasingly frequent and disturbing as winter progressed into spring. Eleanor appeared regularly during family meals, social gatherings, and everyday household activities, always wearing the elegant blue gown she had worn during Catherine's wedding reception and maintaining the same carefully crafted smile that had been created through post-mortem preparation. But unlike typical ghost stories where supernatural presences were frightening or malevolent, Eleanor's continued presence was characterized by an almost overwhelming benevolence and maternal concern. She appeared to be attempting to continue fulfilling her role as wife, mother, and social hostess despite being deceased, creating a form of supernatural domesticity that was both comforting and deeply disturbing. Margaret began receiving detailed instructions from Eleanor about household management, social obligations, and family financial decisions, communicated through dreams that were so vivid and specific that she found herself implementing her deceased mother's advice in her daily life. These supernatural consultations covered everything from menu planning for social events to investment strategies for the family's business interests. "Mother is more involved in our daily lives now than she was when she was alive," Margaret told Dr. Morrison during one of their sessions. She provides detailed guidance about every aspect of household and social management, as if her death has given her more time and energy to devote to family oversight rather than less. The family's social position in Millbrook's community became increasingly complicated as more residents reported seeing Eleanor at various public events and gatherings. Church services, charity functions, and business meetings all featured sightings of Eleanor Whitmore, elegantly dressed and graciously participating in community activities despite being officially deceased and buried. These public appearances of Eleanor's spirit created a community-wide crisis as residents struggled to reconcile their clear memories of her presence with the official record of her death and burial. Some began to question whether she had actually died, while others wondered if her spirit was so devoted to social obligations that death could not prevent her from fulfilling her community responsibilities. Father McKenna at St. Mary's Episcopal Church found himself counseling numerous parishioners who reported seeing Eleanor during Sunday services, sitting in her accustomed pew and participating in hymns and prayers with her characteristic devotion and dignity. Mrs. Whitmore appears to be more committed to church attendance now than she was during her lifetime, Father McKenna told Dr. Morrison during a consultation about the supernatural phenomena. Parishioners report that she seems more present and engaged during services, as if death has somehow intensified rather than ended her spiritual devotion. The situation reached a crisis point when Eleanor began appearing in photographs taken at various community events. Positioned among living residents as naturally as she had been positioned among her family members during Catherine's wedding reception, these posthumous photographic appearances followed the same pattern as her presence during the wedding. She appeared solid, three-dimensional, and perfectly integrated into group compositions, but only in photographs rather than being visible to the people present during the actual events. Mr. Silas Cunningham, the photographer who had documented Eleanor's posthumous participation in Catherine's wedding, found his professional reputation challenged by clients who discovered deceased individuals in their family and community photographs. Eleanor's appearances in these images were so consistent and natural that many people began to question the reliability of photography as a medium for documenting reality. I can find no technical explanation for Mrs. Whitmore's continued appearance in photographs, Cunningham told the Whitmore family during a consultation about the phenomenon. She appears in images taken with different cameras under various lighting conditions, always positioned naturally among living subjects, but never visible to observers during the actual photographic sessions. The family's attempts to address Eleanor's supernatural presence through conventional religious intervention proved unsuccessful. Father McKenna's prayers for her peaceful transition to the afterlife seemed to have no effect on her continued involvement in family and community affairs. If anything, religious ceremonies appeared to strengthen rather than diminish her connection to the living world. Dr. Morrison's medical expertise proved equally inadequate for addressing supernatural phenomena that operated outside the boundaries of scientific understanding. His knowledge of anatomy and post-mortem preparation had enabled the family's original deception, but offered no solutions for resolving the spiritual consequences of that deception. As spring turned to summer in 1876, the Whitmore family found themselves living in a state of supernatural domesticity, where Eleanor continued to fulfill her roles as wife, mother, and community member despite being officially deceased. Her presence provided comfort and continuity for family members who missed her guidance and support, but also created psychological pressure and social complications that grew more severe over time. Catherine's marriage to Jonathan Blackwood began to deteriorate under the strain of living with the supernatural consequences of her wedding deception. Jonathan, who had not been informed about Eleanor's true condition during the wedding ceremony, struggled to understand his wife's psychological distress and the family's ongoing supernatural experiences. "I married into a family, not a haunting," Jonathan told Catherine during one of their increasingly frequent arguments about her mother's continued presence. "I understand that grief can create the illusion of supernatural contact, but the entire community is reporting interactions with your supposedly deceased mother. Either she's alive and you've all been lying about her death, or you've somehow created a situation where the dead refuse to rest." The truth about Eleanor's posthumous participation in Catherine's wedding gradually became known throughout Millbrook's social community, creating scandal and social ostracism that threatened to destroy the family's reputation and business interests. The revelation that they had used a corpse as a prop in their wedding celebration violated every normal standard of decency and appropriate behavior, transforming them from respected community leaders into objects of horror and disgust. But perhaps more disturbing than the social consequences was the growing realization that Eleanor's supernatural presence was not diminishing over time, but was instead becoming stronger and more integral to the family's daily existence. She had become a permanent member of the household whose death had not ended her involvement in family life, but had instead freed her from the physical limitations that had constrained her domestic and social activities during her lifetime. The family that had been willing to cross the boundary between life and death to preserve their social obligations discovered that some boundaries, once crossed, could never be recrossed. Eleanor Whitmore, who had stood smiling in her daughter's wedding portrait despite being dead for days, had used that artificial participation in life to create a permanent connection between the worlds of the living and the dead. Her radiant smile, so carefully crafted through post-mortem preparation to appear joyful and maternal, had indeed captured something essential about her relationship with her family. But what it had captured was not life, but a form of death so devoted to domestic duty that mortality itself could not sever the bonds of family obligation and social responsibility. The woman in the 1875 portrait had been dead when she smiled for the camera, but her death had been transformed into a new form of existence that transcended the normal boundaries between life and death. The price of their deception had been the creation of a supernatural presence that would continue to influence their family and community for generations to come, proving that some social obligations are too sacred to end, even in death.